Hey everybody, I'm Silas, and welcome to Psilocybology. Let's expand our mind. This is a series where we talk about the research on Psilocybin, the psychedelic prodrug found in magic mushrooms. We'll be breaking down and discussing the scientific literature, one study at a time, from past to present. If you'd like to support the show, please rate and review the podcast wherever you can. Every like, comment, and subscribe really helps, and I greatly appreciate it. You can find out more about supporting the show at psilocybology.org/support. Now today's episode is actually going to be a bit different than usual. In honor/celebration of my first listener-submitted question, I wanted to spend this episode providing an answer. I'm not sure if I plan to turn every question into its own episode, but figured I'd at least give it a try here and see how it goes. Plus, I think in answering this particular question, there's actually a good amount to discuss. And before we start, I want to mention that all of the articles I used to put together this information will be linked in the episode transcript, which as always you can find on the website. So the question that was asked was essentially, how much does body weight affect the subjective effects of psilocybin? Does someone who weighs 100 kilograms, or 220 pounds, for example, need twice as much psilocybin as someone who weighs 50 kilograms, or 110 pounds, in order to feel the same effect? For those who may be just joining the podcast, in many studies into psilocybin, what you'll find is that researchers use weight-adjusted dosing, meaning that they will administer a dose that is calculated based on the weight of the participant. In a lot of modern-day research, you might see this reported as a dose of 30 milligrams of psilocybin per 70 kilograms of body weight. This means someone who weighs 154 pounds would be given exactly 30 milligrams, but someone weighing 90 kilograms or 198 pounds would be given about 39 milligrams of psilocybin. The idea behind this approach is the assumption that the pharmacokinetics, which is the movement of drugs through the body, such as how they are metabolized, and the pharmacodynamics, or the mechanisms of action for how drugs exert their effects, vary depending on body weight. In some instances, we know this to be the case. Take, for example, alcohol. In general, someone who weighs 198 pounds will have a lower blood alcohol concentration than someone who weighs 154 pounds and drank the same amount. This is because body weight influences how alcohol is diffused in the body. In other instances, however, body weight may have minimal or no impact on how the drug moves through and interacts with the body. There are also so many additional factors that influence drug plasma concentration, like genetics, sex, circadian rhythms, some health conditions, smoking status, just to name a few. To really complicate things, for some drugs, body weight may even have the inverse effect on drug action, making individuals who weigh more sensitive to a drug than individuals who weigh less. One study that was mentioned in a presentation by Garcia Romeo, which we'll be talking more about in a bit, found that as BMI increased, so did serotonin 2A receptor binding. I won't go into all the details here about this receptor, but essentially this could mean that individuals with this increased binding might have an increased sensitivity to a drug that exerts its effects through that receptor system. The other complicating factor we need to consider behind weight-adjusted dosing is that it assumes there is a proportional relationship between body size and body composition. We know, however, that the body composition of a 90-kilogram athlete can be very different than the body composition of a 90-kilogram individual who doesn't engage in much physical activity. Overall, the use of weight-adjusted dosing only makes sense if, as we just discussed, the pharmacodynamic and pharmacokinetic characteristics of a drug scale proportionately with body weight. Unfortunately, this assumption would need to be tested for each individual drug, or at the very least, each drug type, which is usually not done. Now, just to provide another example of when this assumption might hold true, just this past summer in 2018, there was a brief report in The Lancet discussing the case for weight-adjusted dosing of aspirin. They point to evidence that individuals with a larger body mass would have a greater quantity of esterases, which help to remove aspirin from the body. This would thus require an individual with larger body mass to take more aspirin in order to achieve the same effects as someone with a smaller body mass. They actually put forward the hypothesis that this might be what is responsible for the sex differences that have been found in response to aspirin. specifically the finding that aspirin is more efficacious at preventing stroke in females than in males. They hypothesized that this may be an artifact of the fact that females on average weigh less than males. But what about psilocybin? That's why we're really here, right? Is weight-adjusted dosing for psilocybin better or worse than fixed/flat dosing, if there's any meaningful difference at all? Unfortunately, it doesn't look like there's been any studies that have intentionally and rigorously tested this. However, there is some data we can look at that may at least get us closer to an understanding of the truth. So to try and answer this question, I came across an interesting presentation, as I mentioned earlier, by Dr. Garcia Romeo, which he gave at the 2017 Psychedelic Science Conference. I'll provide the link to the video in the episode transcript, which again you can find at psilocybology.org. His aim with the presentation, to be transparent, was to make the case for why in future clinical trials, researchers could use flat dosing as opposed to weight-adjusted dosing in order to save money and make it less time-intensive for the researchers. To do this, he pulled together data from 7 studies that used weight-adjusted dosing and tried to reconfigure the data in a way that might provide information in support of this hypothesis. He goes through a few sets of analyses, and I'll be honest, some I don't feel fully disentangle the confounding factors involved, but there are 2 sets of analyses in particular that I think were really insightful. The first that I want to talk about hinged on one key feature of the studies that he pulled together: the fact that in the 7 studies he took data from, the doses administered ranged from 22 milligrams psilocybin per 70 kilogram body weight to 30 milligrams psilocybin per 70 kilogram body weight. To show why this is important and to illustrate the impact of this, let's keep in mind 2 groups of theoretical participants. One which consists of participants that weigh 70 kilograms, and another which consists of participants that weigh 90 kilograms. Depending on the study, participants weighing 70 kilograms were given between 22 and 30 milligrams of psilocybin, and participants weighing 90 kilograms were given between 28 and 39 milligrams of psilocybin. Theoretically then, some 70 kilogram participants would have been given the same dose as some 90 kilogram participants. So using these overlapping intervals, he looked at participants that were all given either 22, 23, or 24 milligrams of psilocybin. The body weight for this subset of 50 participants ranged from about 110 to 190 pounds, or 50 to about 86 kilograms. He then looked to see if body weight was correlated with outcomes such as self-reported drug intensity. What he found was that body weight was not correlated with self-reported drug intensity. This finding would suggest that flat rate dosing could be an appropriate strategy for research into psilocybin. Although there are limitations with how strong of a conclusion we can draw from this, I will say that the methodology was pretty creative. The second set of analyses did something a bit different. Instead of taking a subset of participants given the same absolute dose, this time he took a subset of everyone given the same weight-adjusted dose of 30 milligrams per 70 kilograms body weight. Now, as a reminder, the goal of weight-adjusted dosing is to make sure that everyone is given an equivalent experience or manipulation. Theoretically, a 70 kilogram participant receiving 30 milligrams of psilocybin should then have the same experience as a 90 kilogram participant given 39 milligrams of psilocybin, all else being equal. Well, that's exactly what he found in this set of analyses. He found that the absolute dose administered within this subset of participants was unrelated to self-reported drug intensity. This then, unlike the other analyses we talked about, supports the continued use of weight-adjusted dosing. If instead he found that participants within this subset who were given higher doses also reported higher drug intensity, this would mean that the participants who weighed more wouldn't need to be given a higher dose, because in doing so it increases the intensity of their experience. Ultimately, this doesn't really give us a final answer to our question, because the data sort of supports both weight-adjusted and flat dosing. Now, one could argue that means by default flat dosing wins, because this data suggests that there isn't a huge difference either way, but I'd argue a lot more research is needed. Now, there's one last bit of data that I want to bring up, which he does mention in his presentation, but comes from a separate study conducted in 2017. The researchers of this study ran a set of simulations that were built based on a model developed for the pharmacokinetic profile of psilocybin. These models specifically sought to examine the effect of administering a fixed dose of psilocybin compared to a weight-adjusted dose. One thing they found was that the predicted drug plasma concentration across participants would be largely similar whether they were given a 25 mg flat dose or a 21 mg per 70 kg weight-adjusted dose. As the researchers note in their discussion section, this indicates that it may be possible to find a flat dose that is largely comparable to a given weight-adjusted dose, which would make future clinical trials much easier to conduct. So what does all this mean? Again, it means to have a totally clear picture, more research is needed. That said, the use of weight-adjusted dosing, at the very least, doesn't appear critical, and there's evidence that flat dosing may also be effective. Now, I'd like to end this episode with two quotes that I was reminded of when putting this episode together. The first is a quote taken from The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus. Quote, "Seeking what is true is not seeking what is desirable." I was reminded of this quote not because I think there's been any ill intent whatsoever by any of the researchers I've discussed, but because as future research is done to answer this question, I hope we remember that the goal isn't to find an answer that leads to the cheapest or easiest outcome. It may be the case that using a flat dose is better than using a weight-adjusted dose, in the case of psilocybin. Perhaps using a weight-adjusted dose actually has the potential to do harm by putting individuals who weigh more at an increased risk for unanticipatedly more intense experiences. But it may also be the case that using a weight-adjusted dose is better than using a flat dose because it yields more comparable experiences across participants. There will always be a number of pros and cons to consider, but in my opinion, the most important pros will always be the ones that yield higher quality research and are better for the participants involved. The second quote is by David Mitchell, taken from an episode of QI, which is a British panel show for anyone who may not be familiar. For context, this portion of this particular episode was discussing a study that looked at whether or not wearing vertical or horizontal stripes actually changes how tall or wide you appear to others. Quote, "Surely, the fact that this study had to be conducted shows actually that it makes no real difference at all. We're determining whether wearing vertical or horizontal stripes make you look thinner. And you can't tell by looking. You have to do research. The difference is so slight that you have to do research with hundreds and hundreds of people. Basically, people look as fat or thin as they are." End quote. Anyway, that's it for today's episode. As always, I really hope you enjoyed the show. If you have any questions, feedback, or ideas for the podcast, please let me know. You can find out all the ways to reach me on the website, psilocybology.org. And to the listener who submitted the topic for today's episode, thank you so much for asking, and I hope this helps, even though admittedly it doesn't provide a definitive response. If anyone else has a question you'd like answered, send me an email at psilocybologist@gmail.com. I can't promise each question will make it into its own episode, but it will at the very least make it up on the FAQ section of the website. Thank you all for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.